Henry VIII is known for being one of the bloodiest kings in history. He's most famously known for having 6 wives and for beginning the English Reformation, as he wished greatly to divorce his wife Catherine of Aragon for Anne Boleyn. In fact, he even ordered the executions of 2 of his own wives and took great steps to erase them from history. He was a king greatly loved by his population, but Henry was rather brutal with his laws and rules. Throughout his reign, 70,000 people were executed in public in his kingdom. He did do many good things throughout his time on the throne, for example allowing the Bible to be translated into English and to be a pioneer of the English Royal Navy, growing their fleet of ships. But little can detract from his savage reputation, and today we look at the bloody execution years of Henry VIII's reign, those years in particular throughout his time on the throne that he ordered some of the most shocking executions seen across the country. Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Henry did not just execute common criminals in England, he is remembered for targeting some of his closest friends and advisors, and also his wives. He would go on to regret ordering a few executions. However, when you consider the population of England to have been around 3 million, the number executed in Henry's time on the throne points to almost 3% of the population being slaughtered. There were many different methods used, the most common being beheading by axe, hanging, drawing and quartering, and even some rarer ones were used such as pressing and even boiling alive. Most of these were performed in public to deter the public from offending and to keep them in line. In the first year of his reign, Henry began his time on the throne by ordering the executions of 2 of his father's advisors. Edmund Dudley and Robert Empsom were both incredibly unpopular, and they had been responsible for taxing the people of England heavily, and Henry blamed both of them for this. By executing the pair, Henry solidified his stance as a brutal king from day one, but also won over the affection of his people from early on, targeting these 2 loathed figures. Both were executed on the 17th of August 1510 on Tower Hill, outside the Tower of London, being beheaded by the commoner's axe. They were a sign of the old regime and of oppression, and for these executions Henry won favour with the public. In the 4th year of his reign, he went after a few more threats to his leadership. Edmund de la Pole was a descendant of the York dynasty, and at first his family swore their loyalty to the Tudors. However, they later tried to claim the throne themselves. He had been imprisoned, and when Henry VIII came onto the throne, he was still inside the Tower of London. He was held there for 7 years, and was then dragged out onto Tower Hill, declared a traitor and beheaded. It was said that Henry's father, Henry VII, had ordered his son to execute Edmund when he came onto the throne immediately, but he did wait a number of years. In year 12, Henry also went after Edward Stafford. He was the Duke of Buckingham, and Edward was in trouble. He was a descendant to Edward III, and it was claimed that he had a legitimate and stronger claim to the throne than Henry VIII in the Tudor dynasty ever did. It was believed that if Henry VIII died, as did his eldest daughter Mary, then Stafford could become the next king. Henry VIII investigated this, and Buckingham was taken from his castle to court, not really knowing what was going on, and he was then imprisoned in the Tower. He was charged with imagining the death of the king, and allegedly spoke to a prophet about this. Stafford denied everything, but once again was sentenced to death. It was said of his execution, "This morning the late Duke of Buckingham was taken from the Tower to the scaffold at the usual place of execution with a guard of 500 infantry. On bended knees he recited the Psalms, and with great composure called the executioner and requested him to dispatch him quickly. He had his eyes blindfolded and laid his neck on the block, with the executioner's axe severing his head from his body with 3 strokes. By executing Stafford along with de la Pole, Henry was instilling his Tudor claim to the throne, eliminating any possible threats. Executions continued throughout England in Henry's reign, with thieves, murderers and traitors being put to death. Henry didn't really have much regard for people's background. For example, he even executed monks and nuns, but in particular the 26th year of his reign was a notably bloody one. By 1535, Henry had divorced his first wife Catherine of Aragon, and was in the midst of plunging England into the Reformation, outlawing the Catholic faith and claiming himself to be the supreme head of the Church of England. People across the land, and in particular the clergy and his advisors, had to swear their support to the king, and accept him as the head of the church. Henry was also married to Anne Boleyn, and dissent against his second wife was considered also to be very serious. In the 26th year of his reign, the summer of 1535 was incredibly bloody. Henry ordered the executions of Bishop John Fisher, and also his close adviser and friend, Sir Thomas More. More's execution was down to the fact he refused to support the king in his new religious position, and Henry grew tired of his former adviser. Both More and Fisher refused to accept the oath of supremacy, and their sentence for this was death. That year too, 3 monks were also hanged, drawn and quartered for their refusals, but More and Fisher for their treason were beheaded up on Tower Hill. The executions of these men, in particular More, greatly shocked the nation. But it was Henry's 27th year on the throne that is marked as one of the most ruthless. 1536 was a huge year in England. The most shocking execution of Henry's reign possibly is that of his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Anne had not given Henry his greatest wish, a son, to continue the Tudor dynasty. Despite giving him a daughter, the future Elizabeth I, Anne miscarried a number of times, and Henry grew incredibly frustrated with her. Because of this, he placed Thomas Cromwell in charge of manipulating the king out of his marriage to Anne, as he was falling for his third wife, Jane Seymour. Cromwell orchestrated a web of political spin and lies that resulted in the execution of Anne and 5 other men, including her own brother, sentenced to death for treason, adultery, and even incest. The men were executed in quick fashion on the 17th of May, 1536, and 2 days later Anne was executed by a French swordsman on Tower Green inside the Tower of London. The Pilgrimage of Grace rose up the following year, and this protest and rebellion was possibly the most serious of Henry's reign. The protesters were unhappy with the closing of the monasteries, and Henry, once the rebellion was put down, put the leaders to death, executing Robert Aske and many more who supported it. Also, he executed the Fitzgeralds at Tyburn for treason, and many more were executed in that year, marred by unhappiness within the population, with the fallout from the English Reformation and the changes to the Church. The 31st year of Henry's reign was marred by the execution of one man who was incredibly close to the king, and Henry regretted ordering Thomas Cromwell's execution. The man who masterminded the execution of Anne Boleyn was himself brought to the beheading block for his failings with organising the king's 4th marriage to Anne of Cleves. Year 32 was also incredibly bloody. Henry ordered the execution of the elderly Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, who was executed at the Tower of London while she was in her late 60s, and her execution was incredibly botched by a blundering axeman. But the final part of 1541 was marred with the scandal around Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard. She was accused of having a relationship and relations before marrying the king, and also she was suspected of having an affair behind the king's back with one of his favourite courtiers, Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper and Derham, the men accused of sleeping with the young queen, were executed on the 10th of December, but it was in February of his 33rd year on the throne that Catherine and Jane Boleyn were executed. On Tower Green they were beheaded by axe for treason against the king, with Jane being accused of facilitating the liaisons between the Queen and Culpeper. Executions continued up until the king was on his deathbed, and his reign was one of great bloodshed across England. As mentioned, it was estimated that over 70,000 people were executed during Henry's almost 4-decade-long reign on the throne, which is an incredibly large amount. Because of this, he has gone down in history as one of the most brutal and savage kings that England has ever had, and still today, the story of Henry VIII captivates the world. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.